So now we arrive at the innovation age. But the innovation age includes an increasing digital divide as different folks have access to different kinds of technology. Yes, sometimes the price of technology drops and people are able to get access to it. But the fact is that there is an existing digital divide that needs to be addressed as we think about connecting across different communities and across our society. The number of people that are using the internet has increased dramatically, but we still see pockets where it's not even just that they don't have access to technology, but it's the type of things that people have access to that are different. So quality, the fit for their specific purposes, the language suitability, and so on and so forth. So the digital divide is not just about do you have a thing, but how well does that thing work for you? If we look at technology adoption, it also, varies depending on where you are. Let's look a little bit at the share of United States households using specific technologies over time. In the early 1900s, we had much slower adoption of technologies. It took more time to proliferate through a society or through a country or through a community. Whereas now, and if you look sort of at the internet, the computer and social media, right, at these examples, there's a very catalytic adoption of technology. And there are multiple reasons why that might happen. And so we'll kind of dig in a little bit into what sort of drives adoption and what are barriers to adoption throughout the entire course, but including in the next couple of slides. So there's this idea of techno-economic paradigms, right? We've talked a lot about both the financial system as well as the technological infrastructures and the interplay between technology and society, right? This first concept I want to introduce is the concept of technological innovation. So let's actually define it. So Carlota Perez writes a lot of really great books and papers on this concept of technological revolutions and introduces us to this concept of the techno-economic paradigm. In particular, she describes, the space of the technologically possible is actually much greater than that of what's economically profitable and socially acceptable. She defines an innovation as something that kind of goes from being an invention, right? This quirk, this interesting thing, this mathematical construct, right? This discovery into an innovation as it starts to actually then go into society, right? Investment and funding decisions can actually steer research efforts into particular directions, again, for better or worse. But let's look at some examples of for better. Here's an example of the binary search tree algorithm, right? If you take a computer science class, this is one of the first algorithms you'll learn, and it's fundamentally a searching algorithm, right? And so there were lots of different kinds of searching algorithms that were things that we thought about in mathematics first. We then turned into algorithms in computer science, and really then became the platform for innovation, right? So it went from invention, the search algorithm, to an innovation like what Google did, right? So Google actually took this space of search and turned it into a commercial product, yes, but then also a platform for people to be able to engage with information. So they radically innovated on the concept of search. The second concept that I want to talk about is this idea of innovation paradigms, right? So you have this dominant design that has to appear at some point. It starts with a radical innovation, right? So we have that example of Google search, and it goes through these exploratory improvements as people try to design different kinds of things, right? People are tinkering with it. As the degree of maturity and deployment of potential increases, we start to see clear directions start to arise. And as technology approaches maturity, you might eventually see saturation, but you're still seeing, right? If you're going up that trajectory, you're really seeing people tinkering with that original innovation. That's an innovation paradigm. So let's kind of dig into a little bit more, right? A technical paradigm is then this collectively shared logic at the convergence of technological potential, relative costs, market acceptance, functional coherence, and lots of other factors, right? So if you take the example of the television, it was a radical innovation. It also spurred this entire system of things to be built around it, right? Whether it was broadcasting equipment or TV channels or reality television, right? And this entire industry was spawned based on this one technological innovation, right? So if we take search as an example again, right, while Google really innovated on search as an original concept, we're now seeing lots of people play and tinker with that idea, right, with that paradigm. We have examples so the Brave search engine really prioritizes privacy. And so if you're really thinking about privacy first, you might use the Brave search engine. Ecosia is an interesting one, right? They really come at the concept of search saying, well, every time you search, you're using energy, you're actually causing some sort of environmental impact. So let's offset that impact with planting trees, right? And then Google itself said, well, how can we actually improve our original idea, right? So Google Lens or Google Images now actually allows you to drag an image and actually use that image as your search input. We have more modern technologies like Research Rabbit, right? So if you're looking at Research Rabbit, you would enter in a single research paper that you're looking for, and it starts to actually scrape and present you with different kinds of papers that are connected, really thinking about this idea of connected information, to the nth degree. And then we even have like people playing with the idea in all sorts of other spaces. So if you search for banana on Spotify, you'll get songs, right? So search is no longer just about finding a single thing or just asking the internet a question. It's really about finding the type of thing that you specifically are looking for. So then the third concept that I want to bring in here is this idea of the diffusion of innovation, right? So in a lot of ways, you have folks who kind of start, you have this set of early innovators, you have the innovators themselves, they build the thing and they start to use it. You have folks who are early adopters who might have early access to a technology, and you can kind of start to see that market share increase as different groups will adopt the technology, right? We even have this idea of like late adopters or laggards, as it's called in this image, right? People who may not necessarily adopt a technology until it's really sort of saturated the market, it's very mature, and they're like, super not risk tolerant, and they want to only adopt a thing once it's really, part of our society. And so the way in which an innovation diffuses through our society is also influenced by the ways in which people adopt technology, right? So let's look at this quote for a moment, and it talks a little bit about infrastructure, right? So while some consumer innovations may diffuse very quickly, other new ideas can take decades to spread and reach complete use. And that rate of adoption, right, that bridging of the digital divide, it really depends on the perceived characteristics of the technology, its price, and ultimately the system into which it is diffusing. And you can see, it's not just a single hit, right? But there are waves of diffusion. And so you can kind of start to see like different groups and different communities start to adopt technologies. As people innovate on one, you'll start to see waves and successive waves of adoption and the diffusion of a technology through a society. Here's a specific example that really sort of double clicks on this idea of episodic evolution, right? So in the early 1970s, we have the music cassette. That was something that was adopted by groups. Then along came the CD. Again, you have that innovation curve. The iPod came in and totally changed everything. And now we have, right, streaming on a smartphone. And so even within the sort of general concept of music playing, you can see each of these little innovations really drive adoption in different ways. So the last concept that I want us to think about now is this idea of adoption versus hype, right? In the original Rogers book on the diffusion of innovation, he talks about these different factors, right? What is actually encouraging adoption? You're really looking at, is this innovation better than the alternative? So that relative advantage. How well does this innovation fit within existing toolkits? So compatibility. You're thinking about usability or user friendliness in terms of complexity, right? So how complicated or easy to use is this innovation? People really like to be able to test stuff out before they actually adopt it. And so trialability is another factor that influences adoption. And then the last one is observability, right? So can we actually see or measure the tangible effects of this innovation in our work, play, whatever it is you're bringing that technology into? And this is sort of like the difference in my mind between adoption versus hype, right? If you can answer these things about something, then you're actually moving towards adoption versus simply hyping a technology up. Gartner releases these hype cycles every couple of years, and you can really kind of see how these different technologies move through these innovation cycles. In this particular case, we're looking at the 2023 report. And so you can actually see, if you look really closely, where things like the cloud and generative AI and reinforcement learning and other concepts that we're sort of, dancing around right now are currently sitting with respect to like how people feel about it, right? We're feeling a little bit like there are these expectations that we have of these technologies, but we haven't quite been able to answer these specific things about them. And so it's not exactly clear what adoption is going to look like for many of the modern technologies that we're about to explore in the rest of this course. And so let's kind of pull these pieces together and really think about what it means to engage in a technological revolution. I'm going to cite Carlota Perez again. And she describes the technological revolution as a set of interrelated radical breakthroughs that together form a major constellation of interdependent technologies, right? It's a cluster of clusters or a system of systems. If we look at the types of technologies that we have been talking about, we can kind of see how they cluster and have resulted, right, in the industrial revolution and then the network infrastructure changes that happened, as well as the digital revolution and the now innovation age, right? So you can kind of see these clusters of technologies coming together to really actually create what then will then look like technological revolutions. At the core of each of these, one could argue that there are actually some disruptive technologies that really radically change the way in which we work. You can think about different ways of defining disruptive innovation. This is just one of them, right? So at the Christensen Institute, they just define disruptive innovation as having these three components, right? It's usually centered around an enabling technology, right? So we talked about search earlier. That's an example of that. There's usually an innovative business model, something that actually allows for people to adopt it, right? And so moving from, for example, sending CDs to each other to a subscription model that's internet enabled would be an example of an innovative business model. And then there's this coherent value network, right? Like somebody actually cares about this, not just the consumer, but suppliers and partners and distributors. There's this entire ecosystem around the technology itself. And so you can kind of see how different, right, in this particular case, right, when we talked about steel production, right, you can kind of see how this disruptive technology really short circuits what would otherwise be a very incremental adoption or incremental growth of a particular thing, in this particular case, steel quality, right? We can look at this gap between what the natural progression would have been versus the sort of like radical pace of technological process, right? And thinking about how that's actually been disrupted by the technology itself. But this all sounds very abstract, so let's look at a couple of very specific examples. In the last 20 years, there have been a couple of pretty obvious, I would think, disruptive technologies that we have encountered. The first would be the smartphone in 2007. Yes, the iPod changed the way in which we listen to music, but the iPhone, right, really set the scene for large-scale adoption of smartphones. And it created this entire ecosystem. So it kind of passes all of those sniff tests that we talked about earlier. There was a core technology, there was an innovative business model, right? In this particular case, the app marketplace, something that hadn't really existed before, as well as the creation of an entire ecosystem of innovation around it. The next big one was really cloud computing. And I don't mean, the silly abstract cloud, but I just mean like a set of network devices, right? Cloud computing really allowed for us to start to distribute processing. And so it meant that we were able to think beyond just our local machine, but actually start to take advantage of these large scale data centers where we could really pack in processing speed and power into these centralized locations, but really distribute the processing across an entire network of users. This was fairly disruptive in many ways, including for your average consumer, right? When GoDaddy first started offering web hosting, it, yes, was very reminiscent of what GeoCities was doing, but they had this large scale infrastructure at their disposal and were able to then provide it to consumers at a cost that made sense for the consumer themselves. Other disruptive technologies include social media, right? In 2004, when the Facebook first came out, we all thought it was just going to be like this funny thing that we looked at to connect with our friends from high school or university. And now it is an entire complicated suite of technologies, for better or worse, right? But there were other innovations in the space of social media, right? YouTube completely changed the way in which we learned. And you can kind of see this rise of adoption with social media platforms as each one of them found their own niche in our community or niche in the way in which we sort of live, work, and play using digital technologies. From there, we also have had, I would say, much more quiet disruptions. Because even though we thought the Internet of Things was going to completely radically change the way in which we live, work, everything, it really mostly has influenced so far smart homes, right? And so when we think about Internet of Things, in this particular example, I'm showing you the suite of Google's in-home devices, right? So smart speakers and cameras and doorbells and thermostats. These are really the sort of fundamental devices that are now getting connected, again, taking advantage of previous disruptions through things like cloud computing, right? A lot of ways we're really starting to think about now, how can we control our environment? How can we engage in it? How can we really get access to our entire physical space in addition to our digital space through the Internet of Things? There are slightly more sort of aspirational goals with IoT technologies that we haven't quite hit yet, but these are, again, things that are on the horizon. And so I think they're worth at least mentioning when we're talking about potential for disruption as well, right? So smart cities are something that we talk about a lot as something that we want to aspire to. And there are lots of complicated reasons why we haven't quite yet reached the same level of proliferation when it comes to thinking about IoT in cities versus the home. But this is sort of like an example of how the technology is actually sort of slowly moving its way to our ecosystem as opposed to as quickly as, let's say, with the smartphone. Another one that I'm going to just mention quickly before we kind of move to the end is 3D printing, right? I think 3D printing is one of those that we don't always necessarily think about as a disruptive technology, but it did radically change manufacturing. And maybe if you are in a manufacturing discipline, it's much more obvious to you, right? We were able to empower people to build and produce their own basic goods. I love this example of being able to actually have a community of 3D printed prosthetic limbs, right? There are entire groups of folks that will actually print limbs designed for, all sorts of folks who need prosthetic arms. It's not just something that is a high-tech solution, but it is also accessible to people across different price points, including for those who might not have access to the fundamental technology itself. And 3D printing is also still like this really weird and interesting space for innovation, right? So this is an example from a paper in which they were demonstrating 3D printing with food ingredients, right? And so they're literally trying to print food. And disruptive technologies aren't just for work, right? So they can also be for art. I love this example of Bjork's face masks that were created for a suite of performances that she did. They actually scanned and then 3D printed these lace masks that she was able to wear. And so you can kind of see this finished product. So 3D printing is not just a technology that is now used for, fundamental, important tools like prosthetic limbs or for interesting and curious research projects, but also for art. And I think in that sense, it's sort of really just become part of our entire way of living. So then we sort of come to the most pertinent one for the discussion in this particular course, right? The elephant in the room of artificial intelligence. And so the question that I sort of will leave open is whether or not this is a disruptive technology and how it can disrupt our society, right? This is in a lot of ways what we're going to be talking about over the next few lectures. But we've seen a few different instances of AI as part of this sort of trajectory of disruption. Netflix was an example of the most accessible recommender system that came out. And so you can kind of see how it changed the way in which we expect recommendations for different kinds of things to be made. There's a lot of interesting experiments with thinking about movement and how we actually can create things that move or robots, whether it's simulated or physical. Spot is an interesting example where Boston Dynamics has this four-legged dog that is now being tested in use cases at the national grid. So thinking about this as a tool for scouting in large-scale infrastructure. We've seen ChatGPT come in and do all sorts of interesting things, including cause people to feel a little bit disconcerted as they speak to what is in effect a text prediction tool. And so really the frontier is quite wide open right now, right? Everybody's kind of tinkering with this technology. There's lots of experiments that are being conducted. It's not entirely clear where we'll go, but the thing that I really want us to focus on is trying to be a little bit deliberate about what we want this technology to do and how we want this technology to really be a part of our society. If we zoom out from where we are today, we can see the bidirectional influence of technology on society and vice versa. I trust that we can agree that technology is old and that we have had centuries to refine our design processes. This notion of design is also not new, but our approach, our guiding philosophies, our values, our principles, and requirements have evolved. So we can, if we choose to, reflect on how to grapple with the complexity of the design challenges that lie ahead. And there are many. We are imagining very many different ways of changing our society. We're imagining different kinds of technology and speculating about what we really want the future to be. Today, in the mid-21st century, we have more information about our past than ever before. And we have this opportunity to dynamically interact with and influence our current past. We're equipped with tools to speculate and hypothesize intelligently about futures to come. And so this ongoing information revolution presents yet another curious moment in human history, where we are increasingly producing technology to help us manage complexity at scale. So let's explore what this means in this promised digital futureland in the coming revolution that includes potentially artificial intelligence.